there's something really to be gained from things like that.
Literally the tiny underdog crafters of our planet. And I mean, they're not the only species that's like this. I mean, I think what happens a lot of the times is we as humans tend to like to look at the bigger scope of things, right? We see the advancements of skyscrapers, the advancements of larger machines and the availability of us entering into the space age and entering. But then when we start getting the conversation about, what means for a planet or even our own environment being inhabited, we tend to only fall into, vegetation and water supply. But there's so many other pieces, the underlying to that skin that makes that real that we don't look at.
Yeah, I agree. You're already
Yeah.
singing my song. Yeah.
I try. You know, we I think it's incredible, especially when you're able to be able to write a story, because it's not just a story, it's not just an author's interpretation of things. It's basically like, even in your case, it's like coming from a real life setting and analysis. It's coming from your own experience of what you see and what you perceive, and then taking that information and creating something with it, which may seem common, but a lot of the times it's quite rare.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. That, and that's one of the reasons why I put this together, because so many of us just think, oh, it's just a bunch of raw materials. So we have skyscrapers, we have rockets, we have a sophistication so much beyond the nature that's around us that we miss the fact that we haven't looked deep enough into the nature that's all around us and take the lessons from what it can teach us.
Yeah, I think one thing that I want definitely to touch in is like regarding your book, but even more so is like you were telling me earlier on how like you were even checking on your bees, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Even that thought process, right? As a human being saying, "Hey, let me check this insect or something that I'm caring for." And it goes to the same mindset of farmers, farmers that are raising cattle, where like they wake up 5 o'clock in the morning, like, let me check my horses, let me check my cows, let me see
Right.
how my livestock is doing. That is almost a symbiotic level of human, planet, environment, energy, eco, all working in one giant circle,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, I went into the hive, let's see, this past week, and things were not healthy. There just
Oh,
was, um, well, I'll go through it, but there's something called a
yeah.
lane worker. You have a queen.
Okay.
A queen is the monarch, the ruler, and also one of the things she does within the hive is she is the only one of all those female bees that's laying eggs. Every single one of them is working. And if they take upon themselves to start laying eggs, which they can, every single one of them has ovaries. It's like 99.5% female. If they take it
Right.
upon themselves, they create a bee that doesn't work. Um, See, a female bee is the only one that works. And the worker bees who all of a sudden say we're missing something, this importance of the queen is somehow missing because she's either got crushed because as you're pulling the frames out of the hive, you rolled her, and in rolling her you killed her, or somehow she was you got to be really gentle when you're looking at the beehive. You could kill something and you do, by just moving things around. So you're trying not to make that happen.
Right.
And that's what I went in, pulled out this frame. I was getting ready to do a little bit of harvesting. It's the springtime. Usually by this time you've got enough honey that can be taken from the hive, when you can turn into gifts from people and whatnot. And I open it up, and all of a sudden, within this, what should be a frame that has nothing in there but honey capped, I find brood. I find um, what are called drones, and a drone is a male bee. And a male bee has one job, and that is to procreate. He's going to be
And then
very big,
die.
very fast, yeah, and die. And
Yeah.
and that's all that lane workers can do, because they haven't been to what's called an area where they can be inseminated by a drone themselves. The worker bees can only lay that type of bee, which destroys the hive. It destroys the hive because you've got now a bunch of bees that don't work, and the thing just starts to collapse. These bees come out, What do? They eat, they grow to a size where they can fly, and they leave. And they come back at night, and they continue to eat, and then they fly out. So by the time all of a sudden you've got this transformation because the queen's not in there, the worker bee thinks that she's got the proper pheromones in order to make the hive stronger. You'll have this small civil war taking place because other worker bees will do the same thing. And then you've got this growing group of drones inside of a hive that don't help the hive mature and continue to cycle forward in life. And anyway, that's what I'm dealing with. So I
No,
went out.
that's
Yeah,
crazy. You know
yeah,
what's hilarious is that we talking about bees in bee culture. Men are not very much liked.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's very
yeah.
dominated by a female. Like it is. It's very much dominated by the female antagonist because it's survival of the fittest. Like you've
Mm,
been saying, is where if you've got that queen bee, and obviously, like you said, the rest of them have ovaries and they have the ability to make babies, but they don't because it's almost where like okay, there's one queen. She is the ruler. We don't do this. We're just workers. We're bumblebees or we're pollinators, whatever the case may be, and that's it. But
right.
the second there's a slip in there where all of a sudden those worker bees get this thing in their mind, like, okay, well, the queen's no longer necessary. Well, I'm going to become the dominant. Like, no, the next was like, no, I'm going to become the dominant. Kind of sounds like humans a little
Yeah,
bit. Kind of sounds like what we
yeah,
do to each other.
yeah. And like you
Yeah.
mentioned about hearing the hive, all of a sudden the hive noise. There's this nice light hum that you hear in a hive that's healthy. As this starts to change, because you've got maybe one or two or three worker bees that think that they're going to take over the position of the hierarchy, and of course they can't. But as they start to think they can, they also start to gain little parochial control over portions of one part of the hive against another. And there's actually noise of this slow battles over regions of the hive that begin because you're going to slowly run out of honey. These bees are going to start to realize, oh, oh, something's amiss here, and they fight. And you know, many times it'll just the hive will just get destroyed. Other things will move in because they'll see the bees are no longer joining together to get rid of things that are coming in, like beetles or wax moths or other types of pests that work their way into the hive. And they need to be able to defend against them as a group, because if they don't defend against them as a group, just like you pointed out, that's a little tiny insect. It's pretty vulnerable. It doesn't fly very well. It's awfully colorful, easy to spot. Things think it's lunch. When a bee comes out front, there's a bunch of many times wasps wondering which ones they're going to take off and take home and eat for lunch. They
Yeah.
they don't make it.
No, they don't. And on the other side of that, like I remember growing up in New York, we have a massive roach problem, like
Uh,
massive, even like throughout upstate New York. And I don't know what kind of beetle they are, but they're quite large. They eat roaches. And
okay.
I remember even my dad telling me whenever you see those beetles running around in the basement, it's like don't kill them, like don't hurt them, because they're the only thing that has literally survived off of killing roaches. They've like basically mimicked and figured out where roaches go. They're like, oh, they go indoors, so they follow them along, and they just start murdering them one after the other. It's it's so wild on how we're even in the little tiny like insect kingdom. It's like one insect figures out like, ooh, this is a tasty lunch. Like, let me figure out how I can keep on eating this.
Yeah,
And you're right, like the same thing happens with bees too. Like there are a lot of insects within that realm that's like, ooh,
yeah,
I'm gonna make this breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
yeah, yeah. First time you see them just floating around, or they're flying and they're just buzzing back and forth on the landing board. You go, what is this? I had no idea that they would be so quickly ready to, kind of abscond with this bee coming back with its gullets full of nectar.
Ah, it's crazy. And I mean, even with hornets, You know, there are different like bees. Like we're talking about, like there's murder hornets. There's
Mhm.
wasps and different things like that. What's weird is when you get into the territory of hornets and wasps, you're not even dealing with normal bees anymore. Like
Yeah,
you're almost dealing with like tyrannical little. like not big, like big murderers. Like these are just killing machines. You know,
Yeah.
there are guys on YouTube like they use the slow cam cameras and things like macro cameras to kind of zoom in. Just watch a video of a wasp attacking another insect.
Hmm.
It'll make a praying mantis look like you're like a sweet little old mother.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
They're they're insane.
You
They're
know, there's
insane.
another.
Yeah.
Have you seen on YouTube also? They'll show the landing board of bees, and they usually it's associated with the music of I can't remember something of
Is it like metal? No, it's not metal. I know what you're talking about. It's like very it's like very heavy like beady music. Like it's very like heavy on that right?
right.
Yeah?
Well, what? No, it's a classical
Oh, it's
piece, and what they're
classical
doing.
music.
It's comical. What they're doing is they're showing the landing board, and as these bees come back in, they're about 30 to 50% heavier than when they took off. So the bee is a lot like a minivan. You know, all of a sudden as it flies through the air, it's it does okay, but when it comes back, it's got way too much weight, and it will hit the landing board and tumble and smash against the side of it. It's a full. I mean, it's really you laugh the first time you see it because you don't realize, yeah, that's a pretty stumbly, stupid looking insect. You know, from at least at that point of it, it's not the wasp, the stingray of the insect community. It's the minivan of the insect community. You know, just kind of wandering around out there, carrying back what's necessary to keep the hive going.
No, and you know, it's I think that's really fascinating too, right? Because when we're talking about some of these species, they have been around way longer than we have. A lot of
Mhm.
insects have, especially bees, they've been around for I don't know, I think like millions of years at this point. Probably way before, probably like the run of the dinosaurs or whatever that may be. But they've evolved just like we have. But it's interesting in how even though they've evolved, they still have that issue, like you said, like they're literally almost minivans,
Yeah,
where you think like somewhere along their evolution where like maybe we should have bigger wings like wasps, maybe we
yeah.
should have larger sacs in the back, maybe we shouldn't have where if we just jab our needle in that we just die.
Hmm.
But I think the reason why they've stayed pretty much the same that they have is because it's the most efficient way of them being, like we said, bumblebee and worker bees. That's
Right.
literally the most efficient design. You know, was really interesting talking about this. There was a guy that tried to scale up a bee, like almost like the size of a human being, to figure
Hmm.
out like size wise. And based off of that information, he was a scientist. He realized that bees are extremely inefficient if they're our size. They can't fly.
Yeah.
Obviously, they'd just be bumbling around all over the floor. But because of how small they are, even because of how heavy they are, they're still almost able to manipulate our gravity and still get over that hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating. I'd never thought about bringing it to the human size, but I could imagine that to be the case. If you ever see a bee yard in Germany, it's got little ramps from the ground up to the landing board. And the first time I saw that, I thought, "What is this?" And it's once again the Germans realizing this insect has a tendency to become overweight when it's flying back, and it can just barely make it. So it gives us this little like it's a bridge that appears to be about an inch wide and has little toothpicks on it, so that they can crawl back up into the hive encumbered with all of what they're carrying. You know, the pollen on their back legs, the stomach that's filled with the nectar that they've collected. And I thought,
Yeah.
wow. I mean, it's good that the Germans have been able to figure that. I'm not going to put little ramps up there because at the same time, you know, ants seem to find that same ramp as do the bees, and they get inside your hive, and now you're dealing with a infestation of little ants that you know can become bothersome too.
yeah,
Now the bees
it's
get rid of them.
yeah, it's interesting how like a lot of insects, unlike a lot of mammals, because we were talking about this earlier, a lot of mammals can kind of thrive and live amongst each other.
Hmm.
Insects, not so much. Like the
Right.
second you start mixing certain insects together, they start. I mean, it's worse than apocalypse now. it's
Yeah.
bad. They start becoming like almost cannibals and start murdering each other. Like I was telling you earlier, like
Yeah.
literally you have species of beetles in New York that they
Hmm.
hunt and prey and kill cockroaches for a living.
Yeah.
Thank you, you're saving us a lot of money from pest control. But it's weird in insects culture that like it the separation and division is very much an alive thing that exists there, which is it's odd. It is. It's very strange.
Well, that's another thing about bees. I mean, bees have not only a tendency to defend and have to against other insects, but they'll have
Oh
to
yeah.
fight against other bees. There
Yeah.
is a yeah a robber bee tendency because they're great hoarders. If they can find a beehive that's somewhat weaker, they will attack that. One of the things with the Langstroth hive that's kind of the standard one is you change the entrance based upon the perceived strength that you have in this particular collection of bees. And when there's a weakness, you start to close the opening because it helps the bees to defend less. They don't have to worry about um, a collection of bees rushing in and being able to open up the that access opening so that the robber bees can come in there and just kind of take over and start to kill what's in place. And I found, oh yeah, and if you see a Langstroth hive that's in the middle of a battle, you'll come out there and the thing's covered black entirely, all on the outside, with bees that are fighting each other. For the domination of that particular hive to take away whatever's been collected from that hive, the pollen, the honey to where their hive's at. It's it's something else. And this is an insect though that we usually give a little halo to. We say this is a good one. These are honeybees are great, and all of a sudden you see them robbing another hive, and you go, well, not quite. They are still an insect trying their very best to become the king of the hill in this group of hives that are out there.
You know what? I think a lot of that comes from not being able to grow up in environments that have wild animals or,
Yeah,
insects and stuff. Like I grew up 90 minutes outside of New York City, but I remember seeing wildlife all over the place. And
yeah,
I'm one of those people that are very well aware that even with bears, okay, I know how cute black bears look. They are dangerous. Any type of bear is dangerous. And I mean, they go after bees. They go
yeah,
after honey. And
yeah.
if you think about that for a second, it's something you don't think about for a second. Okay, you have an animal that has no problem being stung by thousands of bees
Hmm.
just so that they can get something that's a little treat for them.
Hmm.
You really think that thing is like nice, sweet, and cuddly? You can go over and pet and say, "Oh, you little sweetheart."
Yeah.
That is scary. That just tells you something about that just tells you something about bears right there.
Yeah.
Where it's true though, there are a lot of animals that don't really give a shit about bees. They're like, "Go ahead, sting me. I don't care."
Oh yeah. Yeah, and if you ever get the bees, if they do attack your boxes, and they do, down here in North Carolina, we've got bees all over the place. They're going to go for the brood box, and that's because bees, though they like the honey, they like the brood even more. There's a higher protein strength in it. And when I say brood box as opposed to super, a brood box is where the queen is laying and the younger bees are developing. She can lay as many as 1,800 eggs a day. So you've got a continual cycle, and it takes 7 to 21 days for bees to develop and finally move out of their uh, those different stages. And so the bee's going to go for the brood box. He's going to rip apart the brood box. That's what he's going to eat. Um, the honey might come along with it. I mean, he's going to be smeared with honey by the time he's done. But you will find that all of a sudden that's the box of the three. Usually, you have a brood box and two supers on top. That is going to get totally mauled by the bear.
Yeah. It's it's wild because as we're talking about this, it just keeps going deeper and deeper and my head keeps scratching back even thinking about Egyptians. You
Yeah,
know, if we can date back to some of the earliest advanced civilizations that had an interconnection with bees, I think of Egypt.
yeah,
The amount of hieroglyphics, the way that they intricate like had honey along with, you know, there had to have been somebody in Egypt was like, "Hey, like, is there a way I can be a bee whisperer and kind of come in here and steal this honey and then kind of figure out all this stuff along?" Because they've got like a pretty well documented understanding of how bees and honey works. I think a lot better than we do, which is bananas because they went like ghost, like their whole civilization collapsed. Like I think two or 3,000 years ago, somewhere around there.
Hmm.
It's wild.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that with Egypt?
Well, I mean, of course, you got King Tut, and you got the 3,000 year ago tomb, which was uncovered, and with it and kept for the afterlife was the collection of honey right there at the end of its tomb. So they thought it was something like the fruit of the gods. I mean, you had the sugar refined by nature, available and lasting as long as it did, right there. Um, there is a lot to be learned from trying to mimic nature, which is what they were trying to, uh, at least I should say, do. But they were willing to respect it and find within it lessons to be drawn, because you do have this tremendous kingdom there of the Egyptians, and you got this tremendous structure there with the beehives, which appear to have a balance and a strength that, my goodness, you could learn from and be able to take something as a lesson from.
Yeah, it's almost where if we look at our past, we can see of how we have had to almost learn and survive off of what is around us. Like for example, with the bee, like just to understand for a second where you have a creature that is able to make a liquid that can last tens of thousands of years. On top of that, is better at preserving than formaldehyde.
Yeah,
And it's like it comes out of the butt of an insect. You know, it's like
yeah.
they literally like diarrhea like coming out of them, and it's insane. It goes against everything you could possibly think of as you, because we're always constantly with sophistication and complexity, and this thing comes along and creates like the greatest preserver of all time.
From its stomach. I mean, it's bug puke. I mean, a bee is
Yeah,
actually throwing up. That is what the honey it's putting back in the cell. That's where it came from. And the
bee throw
enzyme
up.
that its stomach is, yep, it's doing that. Now, don't tell people that because you're not going to sell much. But it is. That's the source of it. Uh, but
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. To be able to see that, to be able to learn from that. We You mentioned living in nature, Dave. When you're in there, there's a lesson that comes from it that you can't get other places. Now, you said 90 minutes outside of New York City. Where? I mean, I'm familiar with the area.
Oh, I grew up in a place called Viola Park, which technically is Suffern, New York, which is in Rockland County.
Oh, okay. Okay. I know Rockland County.
We,
You know, there.
yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There was a beekeeper that was in the Catskills. I remember. She and her husband used to run this. I don't know if they're still around. I hadn't been there. I haven't been there in like 18 years. But that's honestly one of the first experiences I ever had with bees and beekeepers was going out there and, like you said, that black swarm. You're just
Hmm.
standing there and you're just like, as a little kid, you're just like, and there's just people walking around and they're interacting and they're moving these boards around and then I'm just like, whoa, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. Sorry.
Yeah. I got to ask, go ahead. Rockland County,
Yeah.
was there a Rockland chill? There was a place that I used to help out more as a counselor. There was a Rockland Mental Institution. It was primarily kids, younger, teenage. Boy, I can't remember what it was called now. You might have to
Uh,
search it.
yeah, give me a sec. Got my handy dandy keyboard.
Okay, it was about a year. We would go up there and just.
What's it
Uh,
called?
I thought it was the Rockland. It was a mental institution, but Rockland was part of the title.
Let me see. Mm.
Yeah, may have. This was years ago.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Oh, that was that weird building. Hold on. It's in Orangeburg.
Okay.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's in Orangeburg. Orangeburg is like going it's like kind of towards the end of Rockland County, before you hit Orange County, which is kind of like where Monroe, Woodbury
Okay.
is, that
Okay.
area.
Okay. I brought it up because that was one of the things I remember. It was like a Big Brother program, and they would. I was in my early 20s, and you'd go down there and you just spend the day with some young man who was struggling with grasping what life was all about, and just needed someone to play ping pong with or walk with him and spend a little time. Then he'd come up and spend time as well. And this is when I was a cadet, and we had a chance to kind of reach out in that regard. It was a nice way to get to know those individuals.
It what you're touching on is really interesting because that's something that I do remember in New York, especially like when you start getting towards like the Catskills, kind of further up in Rockland.
Hmm.
When you start to deal with, especially people that are dealing with like mental health disorders,
Hmm.
maybe kids that have like are on the autism spectrum, or you got people that got like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome. They have a lot of farms out there, where they're people they own horses and they do like horseback riding, or they have animal stock, and kids can kind of come along and kind of pet the animals and things. It's so wild as somebody when you see somebody that's mentally not well and them connecting with animals,
Yeah.
and nature around them, they become completely different people. Like they don't need to adapt and learn to be with other people. Even somebody that's schizophrenic, them just being able
Hmm.
to pet a horse and take care of that animal, it almost allows their mind to like, I like to call it the Zen mode.
Hmm.
Your mind is able to be in that, and that does change your perspective of how you look at things because you realize
Yeah.
how much of we as humans we force ourselves to be something that we're not.
Right.
And it takes
Y-
people that are mentally ill to see that.
And their perceptions are, not retarded. They're different and sometimes many times stronger.
Yeah,
I
more
remember watching one
more
one of them pointing
connection.
out, yeah, there was a horse in one situation, and it had its ears pointed in two different directions, which I didn't see any difference in there. But someone who was mentally challenged was saying, yeah, they're keeping their focus on two different areas, and the horse actually had turned its ears to do so. And this person who I thought wasn't quite with it was able to grasp that and know that before I was like, wow, I didn't see that, and they were able to bring that strength to bear in the animal kingdom and what was going on that at least in my situation, I didn't understand.
It's it's such a hard it's such a hard way to get yourself out of because so
Yeah.
many of us live in a very
Oh.
industrial environment. We live in a world where we no longer see the night skies because of
Hmm.
light pollution. We no longer are able to interact and see the deers, running. Like obviously, like places like where you're living, or
Right.
like places where I grew up in Rockland County, that's way more common. But a lot of people live in major cities. When
Yeah.
I love when they have those people that post online of actually where most people in the United States live. You
Hmm.
think like, oh, 300 million people, and then you actually look and it's like Atlanta, Miami, New York City, LA, Chicago, and then maybe like Las Vegas if you're lucky, and that's it. Like everywhere else is like like almost like the little bee. It's like little tiny specks all over.
Yeah. Yeah.
That changes people
Yeah.
tremendously.
It does. It really does. Dave, you've lived in, well, you said you were out in the country. Now you're more in a city environment. Do you get a chance to go
I-
out in the country very often?
Um, it's weird. I've been moving a lot since I came back to the states, which was around 2019. I'm right now like in an automotive program training to work for BMW. I'm really thinking of like maybe moving out to like Denver,
Okay.
Colorado,
Hmm.
because I'll tell you something. As somebody that grew up, even though I was like 90 minutes away from New York City, being in nature, there are times where you miss it.
Hmm. Yeah, you really do. I had kids that were in 4-H for a while, and I remember one part of the 4-H program when we were raising sheep. You had a small lamb, and my son was sitting there raising and spending time with it, and the requirement was to sit in the barn with the sheep for 4 hours and observe everything it does. drove my son wild. He was having the most difficult time just to sit there in the corner of the barn while the sheep kind of sat in the opposite corner of the barn staring at him, and to say there are things happening here. It takes time just to observe. And it was a good program. I mean, and I really did think my son gained something from doing that. But most people don't have an opportunity to sit in one spot for 4 hours and observe, in this case, just a single animal, a small lamb, and learn about it. And then to watch it eat, to watch its curiosity kind of come to the surface of what it's looking at and what it's doing. It was interesting
It
and
is.
important. I think that we could give that to other kids if we could.
I I think that's honestly why we have such a almost twisted understanding of animals and species around us. I mean, think about all of the anthropomorphic designs of cartoons and characters. I mean, we make bears into Yogi Bear.
Mhm.
We make bees into these fluffy little bumblebees with these cute little eyes. You know, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Like, obviously, let kids be kids. Let people be people. But there's always a double edge to the sword, right? Where if you constantly put that information out there, what happens? People have no fear of wolves. So then you
Mhm.
have repopulation that's done poorly. People have no fear of bears. So then they overpopulate and then they start murdering babies and then people start freaking out. You
Mhm.
know, this lackluster of it's basically being able, and I think this is kind of like the work that you're doing, which is really important. It's not being like, hey, you can't think like this anymore, like this is wrong, you can't watch this stuff, you can't do this no more. No, it's more of the attitude of here's an awareness, here's something deeper that we've lost that is still very much ingrained into our biology and our evolution as a species,
Mhm.
right?
It's yeah, and something for a long, long time. I don't know, centuries, thousands of years. We have been respectful of, and not just pushing it aside, but saying, there is something to be gained, some strength to be learned that we now believe we've all learned. That places us at a disadvantage going forward, and that's the whole reason for the book. Man's search for sustainability. I'm saying, hey, maybe it's not just a bunch of raw material we can turn into whatever we want to next 20, 50, 100 years. Maybe it's looking back at some successful systems, especially societies, that we can learn from. And there's spectrums. I mean, that's why this book has two ends. It's got the insect society we love, the honeybee, and the insect society we hate, the desert locust. And let's take a look at both of them. One which we say is, well, this is obviously good. This one's sustainable because it provides honey and it's an example for societies, and we put it on the front of flags, and it's become the state bee, the state insect. And this other one, oh, that's horrible because my goodness, it's the eighth plague of the Bible in the book of Exodus. Come on, that's got to be an example that we have to stay away from. No, we can learn something from both if we would spend the time to do so, and that's what I'm trying to do.
I think that's incredible. And I was talking about something about this with somebody the other day where she mentioned on how, you know, rainbows are bad because in the Bible, the way that God represented to Noah that no flood shall ever pass like this ever again was by showing him and depicting him a rainbow. But I think that is my personal view is the wrong way of looking at it. I think it's a way of God saying, here's a rainbow, here's a representation of the beauty of what the world can give you.
Mhm.
We're just like we look at locusts from such a negative perspective, we can look at it as where you have grasshoppers that literally go mad. That's what causes them to become locusts.
Mhm.
And understanding that even in the insect world, there are lessons to be learned for human beings where madness leads to locusts and destruction. The
Right.
second you have that shift of stability, I think that is the lesson of when it comes to the plague. It's not about punishment. It's about
Mhm.
teaching humanity of the lesson of you try to play God. You try to dictate and manipulate the world. Guess what? I'm coming after you and I'm coming after you hard.
Mhm. Yeah, in most people's minds, until did you read my book? Did you read about the?
No,
Uh,
I read a little bit of your caption on your website. And I
okay.
did check it out on Amazon like that has the what do you call that on Amazon? Like it gives you like a little like preview where you can kind of read like a few of the first like pages and stuff. So I kind of went through those first few pages to get an
Okay.
idea.
Okay. Well, one of the things about the desert locust, it wasn't until the 1920s where Boris Yurov, he was a Russian entomologist, kind of came to the surface and said, they just don't appear out of the ground. It isn't just, that's most of the time in the past, people would say this is an insect or a grasshopper that went mad, but how does it become mad? It goes from a color of green to gold. It goes from being, solitary to gregarious. What is this input that makes that occur? And actually, when it comes out, it is so different. It was identified as a different species up until 1920. So up until that time, most people looked at locusts and said, this is just it's an entirely different strain of the grasshopper species that somehow appears out of the ground just when we don't want it to, and it decides to take over the steppes of Russia. Desires, like the desert locust, to deal with the northern portion of Africa, and then put most of those countries, back into the Stone Ages because everything's been consumed. That was not known until 1920 when he says, "Hey, there is a particular environmental consideration that we're missing that prompts this phase change." And that phase change, what he found was that when you had all of a sudden this abundance of um, greenery that would allow this population to increase, that this small grasshopper, who was primarily at night, primarily by themselves, very solitary, would begin to grow in number. And then as that greenery, because of some change in the environment, it became more arid, started to collect, and it started to, uh, almost like a city, find these particular grasshoppers rubbing up against each other, starting to procreate at a faster rate, starting to get into a particular um, phase that would change their color. They also change their nature, and that becoming gregarious, that becoming wanting to be together, flying during the daytime, eating poisonous plants, becoming a collection of what appeared to be grasshoppers now intent on destruction would be was unknown until 1920. And then after 1920 to the present, they said, we now understand at least the fact that this is not, just comes upon us. There's actually a part that gets to it, changes that happen in the environment, resulting in this pretty aggressive little insect who's now decided that everything green is ours and everything that's been consumed you can have back, which
Yeah,
is nothing. Yeah.
it's on the flip side, like we were talking earlier about one of the negative downsides of having these major cities is we've allowed probably on the top of the list, like with mosquitoes, some of the most dangerous insects, which is cockroaches, to run rampant because
Mhm.
we've built these environments, especially like New York City, where they can thrive and they thrive like no telling of tomorrow.
Mhm.
And like you said, it's almost where it's a symbiotic rhythm of where as nature is changing, as like for example with the grasshoppers, as there's
Yeah.
more vegetation that's developing and there's more food and they start shifting their dynamic and start moving to being more daytime and then eventually like we've we've seen there's plenty of videos of this where locust swarms, which if you've never seen it in person, which I've never have, I think any person would literally shit their pants.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they think this is the end,
Yeah,
because they come at you eating their body
everything,
weight. Yeah. And there's
everything.
millions and billions of them.
And what's crazy is because I remember living overseas, like they get sandstorms,
Mhm.
and when you look at sandstorms, like all of a sudden, like it starts to get a little bit gray, and then the sand starts to pour in. But in this case, it's just straight up insects.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's really interesting. That almost where even insects now are almost manipulating our environment so that
Yeah.
they can gain benefit from it.
Hmm. Well, these particular insects could not be controlled up until the 1920s. You would see cycles through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. At least they had from what they were able to gather, where the insect was pretty much in control. When it started to build, you didn't quite know the background of it, but you did know that that was it for whatever farm he had in that area. Then, after about 1920, it started to drop off because it was a United Nations push back and control of these locust swarms. And now with aerial photographs and certain imagery that can show the hot spots of where these insects are most likely going to grow, we have some control over what they're doing. But that's our part of looking at an insect who, by its very nature, is extremely sustainable. Within itself, it if we're taken out of the equation, it continues to search and then maneuver and then procreate and move forward. Now, you can say sustainable. It doesn't sound very sustainable. It's sustainable in its own societal context,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm trying to kind of bring out.
No, and that's the reason why I brought up examples like even cockroaches and mosquitoes, because
Hmm.
it's sustainable in those specific type of environments. You create places that have tunnels and channels and major sewage systems.
Yeah.
You get roaches. You have places in Florida which, let's be honest, Florida's swampland. You really are not supposed to build anything here. And
Hmm.
then you get massive amounts of mosquitoes, especially when humid levels start rising because it's freaking swampland. This is their sustainable environment. This is where their
Yeah.
habitat is, and this is where they thrive.
Yeah. Yeah. You get the word sustainable, and if you try and get sustainable cities and you connect it together, you have a real, at least from the human perspective, a real misbalance because to allow a city to sustain, it requires an input from external to that city. And anyway, in trying to search for sustainability and putting the word sustainable city together, you're I don't want to say it's a misnomer, but it's a stretching of terms that sometimes just don't look like they go together very well.
No, they
Um,
don't.
yeah.
No, because you know what? When you think of a major city, right? I mean, it's a concrete jungle. I
Hmm.
mean, okay, I mean, pigeons can survive. They've learned to adapt. Rodents have learned to be able to adapt. Like many insects have been able to adapt, but there really is no vegetation. There really is no habitat. Like, yeah, there's
Right.
trees. Nice, good
Hmm.
job. Like there's Central
Yeah.
Park as a great example, but that's not, like you said, like that's not a sustainable city. You can't just slab a giant like 2 or 3 football worth of land and call that a sustainable part of us. It just doesn't. For me, and I'm honestly hearing you talking about this and breaking this down. It's starting to make less and less more sense what these cities are doing with this whole quote unquote becoming more, environmental friendly. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah. What does it mean? Sustainability is a word that we have stretched to mean probably way more than it was supposed to in the beginning. Uh, I talk about in the book about it's better understood as a normative term. Yeah. If I can, let me back up with that. A
Yeah,
normative term is
please. I'd love
something.
I'd love for you to break this down. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Dave, when I say a normative term, it has to deal with that. It's got an ability to be an adjective to describe something as better than what it's being compared against.
Okay.
Sustainable would be like more beautiful. You could say this is going to last longer and have less impact upon the next generation than that is. But when we try and quantify it many times and say that's a sustainable X, we come up with sustainability indicators. Many times we turn what should be a normative term into a quantitative term. We've lost the qualitative aspect of where it all started from, and with our desire, turned it into a number. Uh, in that frustration, we say, well, then it's just a bunch of material. We'll simplify all the inputs. We'll get a number to it and say, we're at 6.4, whatever units you want to come up with. That's a sustainable number, and 7.5 is not. Okay, what's for lunch? And we just kind of march off, not understanding the fact that we've really kind of obliterated a pretty important aspect of our very existence because we've quantified something out of usefulness to us, and that's where the natural aspect kind of comes to the forefront. This uh, the title of the book is the one of the reasons why. I thought, well, I chose that title is because I thought it might bring to most people's minds the the frustration that needs to be explained when you say the word sustainable as a normative term as opposed to a let's say a quantitative term, a number. And so bear with me if I can give you a story about
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Have you heard of Viktor Frankl? You heard of that name?
Uh, I am dyslexic, so if I don't know what the person, hold on, give me a second. Let me see. If I see a picture, I'll tell you. Give me one sec. Mm, yes, yes, I know who this is. Yes,
Okay, good, good. Then what I'll just do. Are you recording right now?
yeah. We've been
Okay, so
recording for. We've been recording this whole time.
the whole time. All right. Well, let me. Okay, Victor's and he's an Austrian. I'm sorry, neurologist and psychologist who founded what's called logotherapy, and what it's dubbed as the third Viennese school of psychology behind Freud, who bases his idea that everything that motivates humanity and all of what we do is upon sex, and Adler, who says no, it's upon power. So those two kind of schools of Viennese thought are out there. He though came in and said no, it's a search for purpose, for meaning, uh, and what he did is he derived his concept after they did during the Nazi concentration camp period. He was in the Theresienstadt Nazi concentration camp for a number of years. Actually, he was in three. Um, he was for 3 years. He was in four different camps. He was in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Turkheim. And
Yeah, he has a
he,
very sad story. Like,
oh yeah,
there's a documentary of his. I think it was on Discovery or History Channel, which I
hmm
remember watching with my dad, and they like broke down every. And it's amazing that still a man like him was able to come to that synapsis, even with all the
yeah.
trauma and terror that he went through, which I think is incredible.
Did they go in that documentary into the book's not long. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. But did they go
Hmm.
through his experience in some of those camps? I mean, trying to move toward the middle of the box of men that are marching out to work on a street or a ditch or something, and they would
I
beat the
rem-
dickens out of the
I th-
outside of the group.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, because I remember that the documentary was mostly focused on his experience like during the war, and then shortly afterwards. Let me see if I can find it. I'm almost positive it was on History Channel. Um, yeah, I think it was on History. But yeah,
Okay.
it mostly, like I said, it mostly focused on his story during the war, not very much about his work afterwards.
Well, there wasn't much, at least in his writing that book, that occurred afterwards because he was in those concentration camps in the infirmary. He was identified as a
Oh,
doctor.
okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
they put him at the very end of these individuals' lives. They were dying of disease, or they were dying of malnutrition, or just exhaustion. Anyway, in there he saw three reasons why people were justified why to see another day, because the entire environment they were in were saying, don't sustain yourself for one more day. Don't sustain your life. I mean, just die. I mean, everybody here wants you to die. They've got, you know, boxes, if even that, on the outside of this building right here where they want to collect your body and just bury you or burn you, as the situation was. But he found three reasons. The first reason he found why people wanted to see the next day is because there was some person, a wife, a child, a parent, someone they thought, if I can get through this horrible experience, that'll be worth it. And they would want to see the next day. The second group, they would say, there's something inside of me. I'm a scientist. I'm a I'm a musician. I'm a composer. I'm a poet. Whatever it is, they've got something inside of them that needed to be written, that needed to be exchanged, that needed to be put out, and they would want to see the next day. And the third one, which is logotherapy, this is where it came from, and this is where his book came from. There was a group trying to figure out, what is this all about? My life has got to have a larger purpose in the entire scheme of things. And those were the ones he spent his time pretty much in that book saying that search for meaning was many times the most successful at being able to allow their bodies to push through to the next day. They were trying to sustain their life one more day for a purpose bigger than themselves. And that's why, in using the word sustainability, we're doing the same thing. I don't know what my kids or my grandkids or my great grandkids are going to be doing, but it's not for me really to do so. It's me to say there's something that they're going to be doing. Let's continue to move forward and not just say it's all about me and my little, you know, 60, 70 years of life that I have on this planet. Anyway, that's why man's search for sustainability has to be a larger picture than just, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the land we live on. It's going to be
Yeah.
much bigger than that.
I was touching on this earlier. We take something where thousands of years ago, before we had light pollution,
Mm,
you know, why were these scholars, these philosophers, being so ingrained in our lands, whether it be psychedelics or among other things, where they had this deeper understanding of astrology, far more advanced than we claim to have now.
mhm.
Imagine being somebody around 3,000 years ago and waiting for the night sky to arrive, and you can see the Orion belt. You
Yeah,
can see stars come and go, some becoming brighter, and just seeing that parallel and shift throughout those hours. We've lost that, and
yeah,
you want to. People like to throw that level of like you said, like throw the sustainability on that, but that changes the way we see and interact with the world. I genuinely believe that if we were able to see the night sky, a lot of us were able to see the night sky, that might help a lot of people. It might
yeah,
sound wild, but there
yeah,
could be an underlying issue as to why so many people suffer is because we don't have that ability anymore to see that with our own eyes.
yeah, yeah. And to wonder about what's out there,
Right.
and to marvel about it too. That yeah, you're here, but you're just, you know, it's not just about you. You're not the center of the whole thing. There's
No.
something much bigger. Anyway, that was one of the things that I thought. Let's just go back. Let's look at these two examples, these two communities, and just like, and I paled with the idea that I'm trying to compare myself to what Viktor Frankl was doing. But let's look at this, like he was looking in the infirmary, and why were these people wanting to see one more day on humanity scale? Let's look at these and find out why they would want to continue for another day, and how they would kind of as a society move themselves through it. Bees are
Yeah.
very orderly, but and that gives them strength. But there's a lot of growth in the disorder that you see from desert locusts. So
There
there's,
is.
yeah, both of these can teach us something as they handle what's going forward.
It's
They have,
interesting. It's interesting you bring up with Viktor Frankl because from my own personal observation, when I've been able to sit down with somebody, obviously they're much older, that went through World War II.
Mhm,
Especially even those veterans that even like went through Normandy or went through those towards the end of the years, compared to somebody that went through Vietnam.
mhm,
I'm going to be honest. A lot of those veterans from World War II, they're some of the most wonderful people you'll ever meet. They're very bubbly. They have great grandkids. They crack jokes. Sometimes they're a little bit too inappropriate around the kids. You're like, hey, calm down. But
yeah,
what's so sad is when you see these Vietnam veterans, they are some of the most mentally unstable individuals alive now. Some of the most uncared people. Some of them that are so alone that they just sit in nursing homes for years with nobody caring for them.
yeah,
And like you said, it's being able to see through that ideology of like when you put people through trauma and extreme anxiety and constant stress on a day-to-day basis, how different people will see life and how they'll view what it
yeah,
will be like. What am I going towards?
mhm,
And like you said, you can learn from literally an insect from that. The understanding of being constantly orderly and working together in this constant hold on. Sorry. This constant connection of like everything has a purpose from the start to finish. Like we started from the very beginning. You have the queen bee, you have the drones, you have the wasps, you have the worker bees, you have the bumblebees. They're all playing their roles. But the thing about it is, they can't go out of that role. Otherwise, it leads to utter chaos.
Right. Yeah. It does. Now, let me be the devil's advocate, though,
Yes.
in the fact that the utter chaos that most people see within the desert locust on the other end of the spectrum has a certain strength that, if we see it as a strength, might benefit us as well. Those times that we've been in military conflict have also been times that have forced at least our human development to see technology in different ways and use it in different extremes. Now, the most dynamic or the most frustrating of that, of course, is the nuclear bomb that we are now confronting as something that we had to contend with. But there is something, though, upon that pressure of saying what can be done. So, for example, if I take the desert locust, there is a certain social networking which is occurring inside that swarm of locusts as they move forward into the desert to do, in our minds, rape, pillage, and plunder the next area that they come across. But as a society, they're searching for something that will stabilize that particular group, that swarm, into the next generation and into the next step. That social networking for the locust is because when they've got to this level, their brains are actually larger. They're 30% larger in size than when they were just a grasshopper. It's partially because of the stress that they've gone through, but also partially because they now have to interact with a lot more locusts in close proximity to their own location, giving them the ability to see and also to smell in areas that they didn't have in the past. Now, how is that beneficial? It That strength, that chaos, that difficulty given to that one community gives it a strength that overpowers many other societies that are coming at it from a distance. A locust, a desert locust, is extremely edible. They have a high protein content. They're very close to what a shrimp would be. So you've got a bird population, you've got lizard population saying, "Bring them on. We'll eat whatever you send our way." But they change their color, they change their dynamic, and those insects that use those predators that used to eat them don't, giving them almost an additional strength that we don't see in the past. So what I'm just saying is that you can learn from that. You can see strengths in that particular thing that sometimes we're frustrated at our own society because we're saying nothing's coming out of it. Well, maybe there is something. Now,
Yeah.
you might say, David, you're just jumped the fence and you're saying that maybe we ought to look at it from the other point of view than nature. Well, I don't want to. We are looking at nature, but we're looking at a strength that nature has in what they've been able to use in this situation.
It is, and thinking about that, I go to the we dealing with the Tasmanian tiger, right, which went
Mm,
extinct in the early 20th century, and how much the Tasmanian devil has suffered because of that species going extinct. They get face cancer, they get extremely ill and suffer tremendous pain
mhm,
because they no longer have any more predator. They used to attack them, used to
mhm,
control their population. That's what, like I was saying earlier, like with wolf populations too, it's like we need that balance of predator to prey ratio in order for the ecosystem to function naturally.
right.
Even though we as humans are like, well, we don't like that. Well, too bad. They came here way before us. This is how
Right.
they're able to survive. Um, and believe it or not, like that's kind of the reason why there's been work and effort to try and bring back the Tasmanian tiger, literally so that it can control the Tasmanian devil population.
Mhm,
And, to your point also with locusts, it's the same idea. Like, yeah, they can be very devastating to agriculture, but they do help thrive in ecosystem, especially where locusts are found, like in deserts where these other animals don't really have any other food supplies.
right. Right. And their protein is so high as a part of their mass. It's amazing what, if properly handled, you could turn into an edible diet for most humans as well. There were some times when it would move into a community, eat everything in sight. People say, "Well, that's the end of them." They no longer have the wheat. Well, no, they've got the locusts because the locusts are going to die, and in that desert environment, they dry and they can be swept up and eaten as well. So it didn't completely wipe out civilizations. There was something still edible. It happened to be an insect, but it was still edible.
Yeah. You know, I feel that being able to see and dig deep into not only understanding of what is going on, but how is it working.
Mhm.
We have spent a lot of the 19th and 20th century literally destroying populations of animals and species to the point that we've caused, a lot of animals and species to go completely extinct.
Mhm.
And, we think about it now like, oh, well, nature will fix itself. I'm not an expert, and I feel like you have a better understanding of this than I do. I feel like we've done a lot of damage, and maybe some of it's not repairable. Probably not, like especially when you're dealing with whale population.
Mhm.
Yeah, we really screwed up badly.
Mhm. Well, that's probably learning from it as opposed to running over it with a lawnmower, uh, and destroying it in every way, shape, and form. You're trying to learn from it, and if you can go at it in that light, I think the lessons could be actually gained from it that we are losing. Uh, I'm talking about two insects, for which most people think of all the things I'm not going to worry about. Insects ought to be on the top of the list because they're insects, not mammals, not like you just mentioned in the Tasmanian tiger and and the whales. But these insects teach us lessons, and to have ignored this one, which seems to be at the very end of what most people would pay attention to, we've learned a lot, and we can't just give up on them. We can't just ignore them. Um,
No,
you know,
you know, and you're right though. Like even from the lens of within insects, like I kind of was talking about even with dealing with the ocean.
mhm,
You have microorganisms and phytoplankton, and among other things, you have coral reef, and you have like oysters and mussels, which basically clean and filter out
yes,
the air. And a lot of the times, we can't even see what they're doing. We can't
right,
even see what these species are doing. Like it's not population control. It's it's where everything is working together, even the smallest thing like a bee or even an ant, or even in the case where you get even larger, like for example with the locust. All of these things are cogs in the gears and wheels of motion that allows this, literally this ball of rock, which is
hmm,
basically like a spaceship. It's an organic spaceship flying through space, and
right,
all of these things are like on Star Trek. Like one is like the in the board, or one of the engineers making sure that the fuse propulsion, everything is working correctly. This is what all these things are doing. It's allowing our planet to stay alive and being
yeah,
able to thrive and continue. You
hmm,
take one of those things out, and that's why I was saying earlier is like the second we start destroying species, our planet changes.
hmm, yeah, it
Now
does.
the ecosystem has to figure out, okay, what are we going to do now if we're missing this cog?
Right, right. And hopefully, part of that will be to understand we have narrowed the amount of food that we believe is acceptable for a human diet to such a point that we've become pretty fragile. I mean, I just mentioned about eating insects. Well, a lot of populations, a lot of nations around our world don't see that as such a horrible choice like we do in America.
No,
And it's actually something that, given the situation that we have this structure and we're trying to do our very best on this spaceship as we move through through the galaxies, we need to be a little more respectful for it and also understanding of it. um,
yeah, and it's
yeah,
not. It's not about forcing a totalitarian perspective where we need to become eco-friendly. We need to make sure that we watch every single where we're stepping, so we don't kill any of this. I don't think that's what you're trying to touch on, and I don't think that's the type of message that we're trying to throw out here. I think what you're trying to get at is having a deeper understanding of our planet. Because
yeah,
in the end of the day, even though we get this one life, we are sharing this along with everything else with us,
that's
including
right.
the bees.
Hmm. You know, one of the things that I bring out in the book is Albert Childs and Albert's swarm, which is the largest locust swarm ever recorded in human history, and it occurred in the United States. And it was the Rocky Mountain locust flying over the state of Nebraska in 1875 and being measured by a gentleman called Albert Childs, who was a medical doctor and an amateur meteorologist who had the instruments necessary to be able to track and measure and quantify the number of locusts that were flying through Nebraska, landing in areas of Missouri and Iowa in that time frame. And most Americans in particular have no idea this occurred. The volume of locusts, as this guy has estimated, was about 3.5 trillion. That's trillion. That many locusts at one time flying across the United States, descending on a particular part of the country, eating everything in sight. Pretty much, in our estimation, that would be the end of those states, and pretty
God.
much, yeah. If you're looking it up right now, it was a pretty
Oh
horrific time
my
frame.
God.
Yeah,
Yeah, this is like you think biblical. Nah, this is real life. I'm looking at this number over here and I'm like, did it just say trillion with the T? Like, did they by
yeah.
accident put that by mistake? That is crazy.
But I mean, here's the idea. People say, well, it wasn't it the buffalo that kept the Indians alive? Wasn't it this? No, these trillions of insects coming across at this particular time wasn't the first. They had occurred hundreds of years in the past, and the collection of a protein that was necessary for the Indian population to grow was right there. Yeah, these insects did come over. They ate the grass that was part of the great grasslands area of those states and were collected after they died by the Indians that were in that area and consumed. There was a cycle in there that was a lot less energy intensive than the buffalo and trying to strip off. I mean, of course, they did. They killed the buffalo. They were able to strip off its skin and create different things. But the locust was a key part of their diet,
The
a
the
key part
y-
that's
y- it,
gone.
it no, it is. And you know what's crazy? Even talking about Native Americans is the fact that they not only used every single piece of that buffalo. When you start being able to kind of dig into the other tribes, especially ones that lived more coastal regions, on how not only did they make sure to utilize every single seafood that they had available to them, they figured out ways of even using the bones as
Hmm.
fertilization for their own plants.
Yeah. Hmm.
I mean, if I can't think of a better word for sustainable than that. That is being
Yeah.
able to not only live on the land, but like use it as a way to continue and thrive
Yeah.
efficiently.
Yeah. Yeah. Once again, learning from how this insect did it, but also the gaining of what we were able to get from it. I bring that out in this book as well because
It's
it's
amazing.
forgotten.
It
I mean,
is.
this is 150 years ago. That's not that long ago. But for the most part, people have no idea that this occurred. If you read more in that article that you probably are looking up online, it talks about that some states made, uh, well, they were conscripting everybody in the state to work on the cleanup because uh, we had changed at that time these states into agricultural uh, beds. We were
Yeah.
looking at farms, and at that time there was just a mess of a larger population, an insect collection that was starting to rot and create disease to the water that was in place. Anyway, we're on the other side of that right now. But the very event, the catastrophic environmental event that was taking place, is something to learn from. You know.
Yeah, it is. One thing I've started to appreciate, like we were saying earlier, like especially with farmers, is the ones that are doing regenerative farming, which I think
Hmm.
is absolutely incredible. Because it's not an idea that is new. It's a very old idea. That's kind of where agriculture kind of stemmed. Where okay, you got an insect problem. Why are you spraying herbicides and pesticides all over the place? Like there has to be a way of figuring out, okay, if you're getting these certain types of insects, right? Maybe these insects, they have a prey that is sustainable and can survive in that environment to feed off of those insects so it's not killing your plants.
Right.
Instead of forcing your cattle to be muddled and crushed together,
Hmm.
allowing them to graze and actually feed off the vegetation and feed and be able to fertilize the land that they're walking on.
Hmm.
You see where I'm going with this? It's like where
Oh yeah,
you're doing a farm, basically you're basically doing nature in farming, which
yeah.
is crazy.
Polyface is a farm that's in Virginia. You've probably heard about that. They're perhaps near the top and doing just that very example. I've been up there a few times to see how and what ideas they've come up with, and
It's
they're just great.
amazing.
Yeah.
But you know the what people don't realize, like we were talking about, even going back, even 150 years in history, a lot of these things take tremendous amount of work and effort, not only to understand on how they work, but how to make it work. You
Hmm.
know, you could say, well, I'm going to do regenerative farm, but where are you living? Do you
Hmm.
live in an environment that's very high in altitude? Are you closer to sea level? Do you live in an area like we were talking about where this effectively affected in 18, like I think 1874 or 1875, I
Yeah,
believe,
yeah. That's the
somewhere
time
around
frame.
there? You know, that area has immense amount of vegetation, but you got plains. You've got areas where it goes higher and areas where it goes lower. Like understanding the land that you're breathing and working on is also
Hmm.
so important.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where I guess a lot of this comes to light with looking at these communities, because these communities, bees and locusts, live in, usually bees are in a much more lush environment. Deserts seem to be the domain of the locust. But to understand what they've done in both of those two.
In those environments,
Yes.
equally.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You, Dave, there's one thing I don't know if this would be something of interest to your readers, but the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which sometimes are somewhat frustrating because they've gone to the nth degree in coming up with sustainability indicators that can be quantitated. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's to a certain degree, when you got politicians and you've got that group together, there's got to be a number assigned so they can somehow measure and put forward successes. But they have a diagram on the UN Sustainable Development Goals section, which shows 17 different elements. The bases of this, it looks like a big Christmas, not a Christmas tree, a wedding cake. And anyway, the very center of this diagram shows number 17 of the different sustainability development goals. And it's pretty much cooperation, get along with people so that you can
What's it?
talk through these things.
I
These
want
are
to
the
see this.
United, yeah, UNSDG. Look at that. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And when you get there, they'll have diagrams that show all 17 of these different elements. Some have to deal with feeding, some have to deal with, of course, the bottom will deal with water, greenhouse gases. It'll deal with poverty, income, uh, disparities between a number of different areas. But in those diagrams, there'll be number 17, and they put it as the very center section of their illustration of what these are. And number 17 has to deal with cooperation. And part of the cooperation, I think, is to do what we're doing right now. Look more holistically at what has happened successfully through time in the past to the present. A part which most of us have ignored because we want just a number. We want just a scientific answer or a new whiz bang type of device that will just make it all go away. That number 17 they put in the very center for the very purpose of saying we got to get together. We have to talk about these things because uh, there's some real frustration in the uh, whole effort of the whole thing. Now, if you look and you read about any of those, not a single one of the 17 are doing very well.
No.
Yeah.
You know what? You know, for me, what it is, it's not even being a libertarian. It's the simple of understanding where when you take people such as yourself, right, that have invested time, effort, and energy into not only writing a book, but actually like caring for bees and understanding that ecosystem and environment.
Hmm.
Do you think that these people would, God honest, give you a platform to talk? Hell no.
No.
Hell no. They're not interested to talk to you. They're interested in talking into some greedy ass politician in the state of Montana that probably has never even stepped foot in a mud pile if their life depended on it to represent this. And it's so disheartening because we've, I'm starting to get a little bit like a negative Nancy right now, but we've basically destroyed our farming culture here in the United States. We have destroyed this idea of being able to be sustainable within our own communities. Okay.
Mhm.
This is where we have to get out of our heads. We live in a country of 50 states. We've said this before. There are higher elevations, Rocky Mountains, swamplands, drier climates. I mean, the list just goes on depending on where you are in this country.
Right.
People locally that have lived there for a very long time or have spent time in, developing or being a part of nature in this instance has a better understanding of that community and that environment than anybody else, including the United Nations, the USDA, FDA, CDC. The list just goes through.
Mhm.
So it then comes down to, well, you can't solve this problem globally. You have to solve this problem at home, in South
Mhm.
Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida, in New York, Colorado,
Yeah.
Texas.
Yeah. You have to have participants. And if that group of participants say, this is what we're going to have, then you got some grasp of what's expectations because you're trying to manage expectations. Sustainability for someone 100 years ago was water that wouldn't kill you. In the probably 1950s, it was water you could drink out of a hose.
It
Now
had
it's
lead in
bottled
it.
water
Yeah,
and it had lead in it. Now we're at water's got to be, it better go through an RO unit and be bottled by, I don't know, some bottling company. Sustainability has expectations that have to be handled by the states that you're in, Georgia, Florida, or if, or wherever it might be on the planet. You've got to keep the participation pool small enough to say, yeah, this is sustainable for me, my community, to go forward.
and it's the only way that we can push forward. When people look, we live on a greener planet than we did 100 years ago. There's more
Mhm.
trees on this planet now than we've ever had before. And what I think you are pointing at, which is so true, is we need to get out of this mindset of we got to save the world. No, save your community. Where do you
Yeah,
live? You know,
yeah,
even though, like, for example, I have an artist podcast here, the message I constantly try to push out is what can you do for your community? What can you do for the environment that you're living in? Because if we
yeah.
want a future, like you were saying, and I know that you've got grandkids and you've got kids and stuff, we're not trying to build a future for them globally. We're trying to build a future for them here.
Mhm.
If it's at home, like where you live, or possibly somewhere else that they want to move towards, getting out of that headspace of the world, the global, what's going on in India. I had somebody really sweet that came on the podcast, and being somebody that's in the automotive industry, I have a better understanding of this, where they were talking about how much cars are polluters. Cars are less polluters today than they were 20 years ago. Actually, cars barely pollute than they used to. You see where I'm going with this. And,
Yeah.
you could start talking about pollution. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter if we pollute here because China and India are doing a way worse job than we are. And if we try to build our cities where we live in and out of trees and say hello to the birds and make sure that we don't touch them, we're still not doing anything.
Mhm. Yeah, it's you're getting to the very heart of where do you achieve sustainability? Over what space is sustainability to be achieved, and over what time is sustainability to be achieved? Because you've got this window of changing expectations that you're never going to be able to get your arms wrapped around it. People are going to expect different things 50 years from now than they do now,
Yeah.
and if you think that you're going to get it, you're wrong. You're just confused. You've got to know this space and at this time. Dave, one of the books I'm working on right now after this is the fact that I have relatives that go back to the gold mining efforts in Colorado, the Breckenridge area, and so I've got these things from my grandparents, my grandfather and his brother who were gold miners. Well, you don't mine in a little town in Colorado for the purpose of staying there long term. You get the gold out of the ground and you move out of the way back to a lot more hospitable environment than 9,000 feet. but they wanted, and they actually did want to stay there long term. So there were certain expectations of what that town eventually was going to become. It almost turned into a ghost town before skiing came in and kind of totally morphed it into a different type of environment. But during that time, what was sustainability that they wanted? What was sustainability as an income generator from gold mines that were throughout the area of Summit County? Those type of things were, they could care less what was happening in Europe. They wanted this section of Colorado, the mountains, to be theirs and for them to be able to live on it in such a way that their kids and their grandkids could do the same. That was their
100%.
sustainability. Yeah.
I think that this attitude and mindset of we are Americans, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having a kind heart towards other people that come from other places and other nations. We need to focus on our own country. We really need to focus at home in our communities, and because I mean, you know what? Imagine like we were talking with locust, right? Where you're dealing with something that's used to being more, more independent, more by itself, more alone, and then all of a sudden it's in a swarm of. In this case, we're talking about in the 1800s of like trillions.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing as people today. We
Mm-hmm.
have the advancement of the internet and technology, and we're constantly pouring all of our energy and outsources to everywhere else except our country. Like you said, we've had our grandparents, our great grandparents that have either been in coal mining, they've been a part of the working class in this country, they've been a part of the farming culture here in the United States. I come from an immigration family. My father immigrated here from 1970. My mom's family immigrated here from Austria and parts of Europe in the early, like late 1800s, early 1900s. This is our home. Why are we so focused on everywhere else except our own home? It's wild that we've even
Mm-hmm.
gotten to this place.
Yeah. And your expectation and my expectation has got to be within parameters that we can do something about. If
Yeah.
we don't, our participation for what's happening in Bangladesh will be minimal because we can't really affect them. Their participation, our participation will be stretched too far.
Getting out of that global mindset and focusing things at home, that is the real 17 goals target. If we can start getting big ag the hell away from our farmers. Okay. And I'm talking about companies like Monsanto, Purdue. They're not benefiting farmers. Okay. They're causing people to suffer. And I'm not a hater of corporations. I think it's great, especially when you have larger corporations. But the second you start affecting where you look at the middle of the United States, it's a barren wasteland. There's no automotive industry anymore. I mean, it's starting to build up kind of. I know in Carolina, in the Carolinas, there's been some structure and stuff like that. We've destroyed so much of what that ecosystem used to be, where there was a time in the United States where people just moved in the middle of nowhere and like, all right, we could, we're here to do something like you said with gold. And how can we make this inhabitable? And they
Mm-hmm.
figured out let's make a town and then we can take our product or what our goods and our wares and then sell them back and forth so we can all live in harmony in this, you know, rural area as you would put it.
Yeah.
But maps don't lie. You can
Yeah.
go right now on satellite images and see it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for myself, I don't know about you, that is the future. If I do have a family and I do raise kids, that's the future I want to leave them. Because then in a
Mm-hmm.
hundred years they can figure out what else they want to do. Maybe the community can kind of stretch outwards in something else or another direction.
Right. Right. One thing, Dave, I'm going to kind of go away from honeybees and locusts into what I've been looking at recently, and that's the next book I'm putting together. There's a part of sustainability that has to do with pride in the area that you participate in. There, and what I'm doing is I was reading through all the stuff concerning the Rocky Mountains and these little mining towns. There was this overarching emphasis on baseball teams. So these little tiny towns with a population of 400 to 500, who then would go over and play another little mining town with about the same population, and the entire town, almost in mass, would go over with both of them. And the participation part of it and the desire to have a winning team And these little towns was a part of wanting them to stick around, to convince these miners and their families, which I'll tell you, it was about 80% guys in these towns. There weren't a lot of families around, but to
No.
stick around for through another hard winter, had to deal a lot with the pride of the town that they were part of. It was making them sustainable because it was local. It was making them sustainable because they could participate in the representation of a nine-man baseball team. And we're talking the 1890s, 1900s, where there was not much on a catcher. I mean, most of the players in the field were catching the thing with their bare hands, or if they had gloves, they were work gloves and stuff like that. But the but but the aspect of wanting to have and expecting to have some pride in the community itself, so that it would see the next generation and they'd want their children to see it, was very, very much local. And it showed, as I see from this thing, more of that qualitative aspect of what sustainability is missing. If we lose that locality, that looking at what we have here as wanting to sustain it, we're not going to sustain anything. We've got to be proud, if you would, of the community in order to want to give it to our children.
We got to be able to look forward instead of looking backwards.
Right.
We can spend so much time pointing the fingers and blaming everything for our problems. But, to your point, even in the most harshest of conditions, being able to come together and being able to do something as simple as sport. We tend to forget that is how a lot of industries started. When you think of the filmmaking industry here in the United States, going back to the early 1900s when it first started, that came from people that wanted to collaborate with other artists. Like, oh, you figured this out with your camera? Let me see. Ooh, you were able to erase that out of the film and do it by, layer by layer. Interesting. That collaboration, even in those hostile environments, even those harsh predicaments of where we don't know if this is going to work, we don't know how well this is going to thrive, but hey, we want to be able to have that future together. That to me is the greatest example of what community is. It's not about a flag. It's not about politics. It's not about whose side you're on. It's about what can we give to each other to better our chances and give ourselves that future we so boldly hope to have.
Well put.
Yes. David, I have to say, honestly, man, it's been an absolute pleasure. I love having these conversations, not just because of where the direction it goes and the stuff that we discuss, but how it opens up our minds of how we can see things differently. We're not trying to shove opinions or tell people what to do. We're showing real life, God honest to the truth, even going down to the bees and the freaking locust. It's just amazing. So I know you got a website. You mentioned you have another book that's coming out. Where can these people find you? Like your social media, your website, and all of that.
The website's davidaugebooks.com, and my last name, though French, is spelled Auge. So if you have family from Austria, that's more of a German word than it is a French word, but it's pronounced Auge. So DAVIDAUGE books.com. And that's probably the easiest way. I do have this book out there, Man's Search for Sustainability. You can search either by my name or the title of the book on Amazon. Pick up a copy.
I'm sure. Hey, anybody that's listening out here, if you want a better understanding of man's search to sustainability, be sure to grab a copy because, hey, I think if we learned anything in this hour and 30 minutes of talking, there's a lot to learn that we haven't been putting enough focus on for a really, really long time. Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
My pleasure. Well, to anybody out there, if you do want to check out more of the podcast, you can find us everywhere and anywhere where it's available at Lost in the Groove Pod. We are now on Substack and Rumble. If you want to check out more. So with that, we will catch you on the next one. Peace out. Thanks.